Good morning, Father's House friends and family. Thank you once again for joining us on our Sunday morning video service. I just have a couple of things today to cover. Our men's group is back on Monday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. Our ladies group is on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let one of us know. We'd love to have you get you set up and have you be part of that. Also, for the ladies group, I'd like to invite those ladies that haven't been coming to get back on. We miss you. We'd love to see your faces again. This is our regular tithe and offering this year, or this week, I mean. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our missions that way, or you can give to our virtual wall. We're getting closer to making our goal on that wall, so we'd love to have you skip your Starbucks this week and give to the virtual wall. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area, Pastor Carl and I would be happy to swing by and pick up your tithes that way. Or you can come to church and drop it in the tithe bucket. That would be wonderful too. Lastly, I wanted to mention it is coming up on tax time, and I just wanted to let you know that your contribution statements have been put in the mail. So if you don't get it in the next few days, or if you do get it and something's wrong, please let me know so I can help get it corrected and get it back out to you. If you don't receive one, give me a buzz and I will get one emailed to you or remailed out. So if you give online, I believe you can pull them off the online giving also. So hopefully you'll all get those. Hopefully you'll get all of your money back on your taxes. Maybe that won't happen. Anyway, that's all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? It was good to see Miss Penny again, and as she said, we're here again today on this Sunday, and we're talking about virtues, different virtues. And so this week, rather than a lot of housekeeping that I'm going to do before that, I've got a lot of ground that I probably want to try to cover today. So I'm going to try to just kind of start so that we can get into it and into our teaching that we're talking today about virtues, the different virtues, so that we can kind of just stay on track. If I don't get done today, it doesn't really matter. I won't get done today, but if I don't even finish the thoughts I want to get through today because of the lack of time, then I'll just leave a comma and I'll pick it up again next week. I guess that's the beauty of being able to do it by a video or even in Sunday morning. So we're talking about the virtue of courage. We're really going to be talking about 7 virtues over the next probably several months. So the first one we covered was courage. Courage, or the idea of fortitude, that stick-to-itness, that rock-solid grit when you're facing hard times and pressures from different areas. And so I think we probably talked that through. We talked it through for about 4 weeks. So we should probably have a pretty good grasp on what courage is. If you didn't get a chance to see it, if you'd like to go back and watch it, there you can pick up those videos over the past 4 weeks when we talk about different characters like Joan of Arc, Edith Stein, the disciples in the boat when Jesus was walking on the water. And also we talked about Martin Luther King last week, since it was actually his holiday. This week, though, I want to start talking about a second virtue that is very important, and it's the virtue of temperance, which would be synonymous with self-control, the idea of self-control. Now, what I want to say about all these virtues are that all of these virtues bring about in us, as we practice them, they bring about in us a godly character. But it's up to us to grow in these virtues. They just don't magically come any more than a piano virtuoso becomes a piano virtuoso without practice, without discipline, without applying themselves to their craft. And so the craft of wisdom, the craft of virtues, is the same thing, that if we don't apply ourselves to learning them, then what happens is that we never really acquire the virtues. Now, this virtue I'm talking about by way of self-control, I guess I could start off with temperance. I guess I could start off by saying that it, like many other virtues, is what is commonly referred to by the Apostle Paul as the fruits of the Spirit, right? So we talk about the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, temperance, kindness, and others, and against such there is no law. And I think that we've kind of gotten a bad or wrong, or maybe a deficient, I guess not, I wouldn't say bad or wrong, but a deficient teaching, or I've gotten it in the past, where basically what we've said is, well, if you just plug in to Jesus, and if you're a Christian, then these virtues automatically come, that they will just come because they're the fruits of your life as a Christian. And I guess I could say that is true in one instance if you're following closely the things of God and following closely. But when we get slack and lax in our spiritual disciplines and in developing those things, I think that we shift the responsibility away from ourselves, and it kind of becomes an excuse for us not to grow in the virtue of courage or in the virtue of temperance that we're talking about today, or any of the other virtues that we're talking about. And I thought about a way that I could explain that to you today, that maybe we would understand as why it's important for us to cultivate the virtues of courage, and in this case, self-control. 2 years ago, I had a garden. I started a garden. Well, I've been doing garden for many years, but 2 years ago, I was doing a garden, and I was going to do it all naturally. And so I bought my tomato plants, and which I always do them organic. But this year I was going to, which I'd always done, I was going to use, the type of organic fertilizers that would, be, just the best you could use to some extent, or what I thought would produce the best crop. So I bought some worm castings from a guy at the flea market that we used to have here. And I also bought some of the fish emulsion, which proved to be fairly good. And what I would do is I would use these worm castings and this fish emulsion around, especially around my tomato plants, because I wanted them, as I was fertilizing them, to produce this bumper crop of tomatoes. Well, what happened with these plants is these plants took off and they began to grow. And as the summer went on, there was a couple of plants in particular that didn't get any fruit. And they were supposed to. I bought them from a guy in our church, Moses Espinoza. And when I bought them from him, they were these big pineapple. One of them were these big pineapple tomatoes, and I loved them. They were really good. Well, that plant all year long produced one pineapple tomato that was about this big. It was like a pineapple piece. It wasn't even a pineapple tomato. Well, so, the next year, which was this last year, I was thinking about it. I thought, well, maybe what I need to do is I need to try a different fertilizer. So this last year, what I did was, rather than going and buying the fish emulsion and the worm castings, which probably I just didn't use them right, I went to the store and I bought Ortho Organic Fertilizer. And what I did was I made sure that I was very diligent to not over-fertilize, but not to under-fertilize. And so I put this organic fertilizer around my plants. And I want to tell you, last year I had a bumper crop of everything because I had used this fertilizer, which seemed to work better than the other fertilizers. Now, in that case, my plants produced its fruit, tomatoes, beans, the beans, whatever the case might be. And my hot peppers, they just exploded because of the fertilizer that I was using. And so one year, what I had a crop that was meager. And then the following year, I had this bountiful crop where I was giving tomatoes away by the gads because I had so many of them. My neighbors loved me. And they said, "Where'd you get these huge tomatoes?" I mean, they were the size of softballs. And one of my neighbors actually said, "These are too big. These are too big of tomatoes." I said, "Make salsa out of them. Make whatever you want out of them. Put them on your hamburgers. I guarantee you'll enjoy them." Well, when I look back at those gardens, there's those 2 years, there's something that I see. And that is, one year I had a bumper crop, and the year before that, I didn't have a bumper crop. I had this small crop of fruit. Now, the difference was, when I look back on it, it was at the diligence that I applied in making sure that it got proper water and proper fertilization. And because it got this fertilization and it got the nutrients that it needed, it then began to grow because it had what it needed to be able to grow. Well, as much as that's true for a garden, talk about fertilizing and watering, it's exactly true for our spiritual life when we're talking about the fruits of the Spirit, or when we're talking about the characteristic traits of the virtues, when we talk about faith, hope, love, justice, prudence, which is common sense, knowledge or common wisdom, when we talk about courage or fortitude, and what we're talking about today by way of self-control. And so I want to make it emphatically clear that the fruits of the Spirit, as much as they come from the Spirit, that if we're not nurturing ourselves in those things and fertilizing those things, that we're either going to end up with no crop at all, or we'll end up with a meager crop. But the idea is that God doesn't want us to have no crop or a meager crop. He wants us to have a full-blown crop that is overabounding, or an overabundance, or a superabundance of fruit. And that's what he wants to give to us. But he wants to give it by way of our responsibility to make sure that we're doing the right things, practicing the right things, fertilizing in the right way, so that we get that crop. And that takes us and our responsibility to be able to do that. As much as God desires that, and as much as God wills that, there's still a part of it that is our responsibility to make sure that these virtues are growing in our life. Now you can say, well, what's the benefit of the virtues? And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But if you think about it, that when we talk about the virtues of courage or self-control, or when we talk about wisdom, when you think about perfect wisdom, who do you think about? You think about God. Perfect self-control, you think about God or Jesus. You talk about perfect courage, you would think of Jesus or God. Or perfect justice, perfect love, faith, hope. You would see that those perfections are found in God. So you see what happens is that when we grow into virtues, we're actually growing in the very essence or nature of who God is. In other words, we're becoming more godly, more godlike when we practice the virtues. The virtues aren't there because we have to do them. We have to be more just. We have to exhibit self-control. No, actually, they're the outworkings of how we fed ourselves so that they become character traits. And I want to tell you, they're character traits that when the storms of life come against us, they're never moved. They're never shaken. They're there all the time. I've talked about it in the past, about it in the book of wisdom, the book of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters, talking about Lady Wisdom, that she says about herself that if you don't have her, when you need her, she'll flee from you. She won't be there. And it's because you never possessed her. So when you need wisdom, if you haven't pursued wisdom and possessed wisdom, there's no way for you to have wisdom. It's the same exact thing that's true when we talk about all these different virtues, which I want to tell you are all rolled up into what wisdom is. Wisdom is always courageous. Wisdom always has a sense of common wisdom, a commonness to it, right? A common sense to it. Wisdom always has a self-control in mind when we talk of wisdom. So the virtues in our life and why they're so important is because they create in us and they help us participate in the very character of who God is and what he wants us to become. So there's this profound verse in the book of Peter, 2 Peter, that I want to pick up and read to you that has the sniff of the virtues mentioned in them actually, and it has this sniff of self-control or temperance. And it has everything to do with the fact of how those virtues become unmovable foundation stones in our life if they're things that we practice. So we're in 2 Peter chapter 1, and I'm going to go ahead and pick up in verse 4. Talking about the virtues and faith. He's talking about faith and he's talking about virtues, or faith and character. Peter has this to say. For by these he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises. Now get this. So that you might become partakers of the divine nature. We were just talking about becoming partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now by this very reason, also applying to all diligence in your faith. So it says apply in all diligence to your faith. You've got faith, but now there's got to be diligence in these things, right? Apply moral excellence. That word moral excellence is the exact same word when we talk about virtues. So apply virtues to your life. You've got faith. Now, what I want you to do is diligently work on the virtues in your life, right? And he says, supply all virtues or moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge. So you can see that knowledge of the virtues, knowledge of these character traits become very important. And in some ways, the knowledge of them and understanding what they are and the practicing of them become the fertilizer that causes us to bear this fruit of these different virtues. It says, supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge. And in your knowledge, now get this, self-control. The very word is temperance. And in your knowledge, apply temperance or self-control. And in your self-control, perseverance, which would be a sign of, or in some cases, would speak of courage. And in your perseverance, godliness, godly traits, godly characteristics. And in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now catch this. For he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins. Therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you, for as long as you practice these things, you will never stumble. Did you get that? As long as you are practicing these things, you will never stumble. So you can see that what the apostle's talking about here is he's talking about, excuse me, but my nose is really itching today. I don't know why. I probably got a hair in there I need to cut out. So what he's talking about is he's talking about that when we have these virtues and these character traits, that they help us from stumbling. And the reason they help us from stumbling is that they transcend the world in which we live in. When we have self-control, we don't blow up at situations. We don't take our toys and go home. We don't get mad at people. We don't find ourselves being in a position of excess and in a position of not being diligent in those matters. And so self-control is something that God wants us to have. With that being said, and that when we have those, the Apostle Paul's saying that we're not going to stumble because we have those. So I want to talk a little for a moment here about what self-control or the word temperance means. Now, we kind of have this idea of what self-control means, I think, in a general way. It's like when you see somebody that has a problem with anger. They have no self-control over their anger. They blow up over everything. You see road rage happen on the freeway because somebody forgot to use a blinker, and that person gets so mad at the other person that they lose all self-control. So self-control is basically this. Now remember when we talked about courage, we talked about courage being a mean or a sliding bar of almost like a volume bar between what we would call cowardice or fear, or what you would call maybe paralyzing fear. And the other side, we talked about this rashness and the idea of this rashness of that you would just go full force on in this courage, even if you cost your life when it didn't have to. Just, you never really thought about that maybe it would be better, and courage would be, it would be better for us to retreat than it would be to advance. So there's this sliding scale between being paralyzed in fear and the idea of a foolish fearlessness, where depending on the circumstance, you kind of live in between this volume bar, or the mean between fear and this idea of rashness. Well, when we talk about the virtue of self-control or temperance, it's that exact same thing when we talk about this sliding bar. Very hard to get a complete definition of what self-control is, and maybe we're going to talk a little bit about what it doesn't, what it isn't, and what it is in the examples and lives of other people. But what temperance is this sliding bar again that's somewhat relative between two fixed points. On the one fixed point, you have complete abstinence. It means there's absolutely nothing at all that you can do in a given situation. I'll explain that here in a minute. And the other side is excess, where you can do anything that you want to do and it doesn't matter. Now, believe it or not, we have Christians that live on both of these extremes, don't we? And the idea is that in between these two extremes of nothing, of abstinence, and this other one of I'm free to do anything that I want to do, and I'm still going to be a Christian, I'm still going to be go to heaven, there's this virtue of self-control that the Apostle Peter is saying is one of those things that provides for us a rock-solid foundation between abstinence in everything and from this excess on the other side. It's the idea of self-control. Let me show you the way that that works here for a minute. So if I'm dealing with a situation, and with our denomination, I'll use a good example of that. Our denomination came to, and has come to in the past years, the idea that it is 100% wrong for a Christian to partake of alcohol at all. Especially the ministers are not allowed to drink one drop of alcohol. That would be complete abstinence, wouldn't it? The other side of that is that there's many Christians that believe that even though I'm a Christian, the idea is that I can drink as much alcohol as I want, do whatever I want to do, and it's not really going to hurt me because I'm a Christian, I'm going to go to heaven anyway. And so there's no self-control on this side. But if you look at the mean in between this, or the middle point of these, is if you really have a problem with alcohol, and you have a big problem with alcohol, it's probably better for you to side on the side of abstinence. Now, if you don't have a problem with this freedom in alcohol, then you probably don't need to be veering so close to the abstinence side, because you can be closer to the other side because you're keeping yourself in control all the time in different situations. And so you can see it varies from person to person and probably from circumstance to circumstance. But because a person has a problem with alcohol, and because it's something that they can't have any, or they go over the top, then they probably shouldn't have any alcohol, because otherwise they lack self-control. But when you put that restriction on everybody else, you've gone too far. I can't drink because I go over the top, therefore you can't find any moderation in between. And so the idea, and we're not talking about an issue of sin here, because the matter of whether or not we can drink or not, in Christian theology, it's obvious that there's the freedom to be able to drink. The Apostle Paul talks to Timothy about drinking a little wine for your stomach and frequent elements. Jesus drank wine. When they had wine, what Jesus provided at the wedding was he provided wine, or the basins of wine. The same thing when they did communion, it was wine that was there. So wine's not the issue because it's not a sin. The idea, though, is with self-control is you staying in the middle in this idea and this notion of self-control. So that's kind of the definition between this idea between abstinence and between excess, and self-control is in the middle. Now that applies, and I understand it applies when we're talking about alcohol or when we're talking about food, but it also applies in the abstract way when we talk about anger, when we talk about being impatient, or when we talk about road rage, or whatever the case might be, that this idea of self-control should be something that's a part of our character trait, because in that way we're unmoved when people either project something on us, or we find ourselves tempted to do something or to move in one direction or the other. So that's kind of it. And I kind of thought what I would do is I would talk a little bit about what temperance is not, or what it doesn't look like. And would maybe do that for 2 weeks, and I'll show you the failure of temperance or self-control. And then I'll take a couple of weeks and we'll talk about what self-control does look like in different circumstances. Now, being Christians, we all kind of understand and have heard the story about Sampson and Delilah that you pick up in the book of Judges. So Sampson was a judge of Israel, and I think that he judged Israel for about 31 years. And in judging Israel for 31 years, Samson was a unique individual. He was a man that when he was born from birth, he was instructed to make him, that his parents were instructed that he was to take the vow of a Nazarite. And taking the vow of a Nazarite, there were certain conditions that he had to take. Now, when he took these, some of the conditions were, number one, he was not allowed to drink wine. Number two, he wasn't allowed to cut the locks of his hair. And there were other restrictions. They lived an ascetic life. On the area of self-control, they lived on the side of abstinence for the most part. But that was a vow that they took, and that was a vow that he took and had to take as a child so that he could be this judge of Israel for 31 years. Well, so he judged Israel for 31 years, but something happened later on in his later years in life, after living this life of self-control, that he had a weakness for a certain woman named Delilah. And Delilah, while they were in this process, Delilah was this beautiful Philistine woman who was a part of a band or tribe of people known as the Philistines. And the Philistines hated the Jews, and they were their common enemy. And so in many cases, it was Samson that was called upon to destroy or to push back the Philistines so the Israelis or the Jews could live in their land. Short story. That I'm just going to, a little bit of a background that I want to give you. So there were these natural enemies, but he fell in love with this woman that was a part of the clan of his natural enemies. And so his natural enemies went to her and said, we know that he is lacking in self-control concerning sleeping with you, having sex with you. And what we want to know is, what is his secret as to why he has so much strength? At the end of the day, she would bind him in cords and say, Samson, the Philistines are upon him. He would break the cords and he would be free, and they couldn't stop him. But she kept asking, what's the strength? What's the source of your strength? Now, it's true that the Holy Spirit was the source of his strength, but the Holy Spirit and the presence or his consecrated life, part of that and the secret was that it was the locks of his hair that had grown long. And that if the locks of his hair were cut off, that what would happen is he would lose his strength. So Delilah, night after night, would pressure him as to what it was, and he would play this game back and forth with her. Well, one day, living a life of intemperance, an intemperate life, not displaying much self-control, by being with Delilah and all the things that entailed, she finally pressured him to tell him what the secret was of his strength. And so, falling in love, being blinded, and in a moment of his lack of self-control, which was now kind of a habit in his life, he told her that his strength lied in his hair. So she bound him like she always did, and they snuck in and they cut his hair off. And when she aroused to waken him to see if his strength had left, surely he was no longer allowed, he no longer had the strength to break these bands that were on him, these ropes that tied him, these shackles that shackled him. So he lost his strength, and in the middle of it, they came in, and what they did is they put a branding iron on his eyes and blinded him so that he could no longer ever attack the people of the Philistines. In other words, they had vanquished their enemy by the lack of his self-control. Because of that, what had happened is his hair was cut, he was blinded, and they turned him into a beast of burden. He went to work at the grinding mill, almost in the place, because of his strength, almost at the place of a donkey or of an ox that would push the grinding wheel around. Now, it is true that his hair began to grow back, and there was one instance later where he was able to display this strength again. The moral of the story that I want to tell today in a nutshell is the idea is that Samson lost his glory. Samson lost his strength. Samson lost his right to judge the people of Israel simply because he lacked self-control. And that self-control cost him, in some sense, it cost him his freedom, it cost him his eyesight, and in the end, it ultimately cost him his life. You see, the thing that Samson lacked is exactly what Peter talked about when he said, if you apply to your faith virtue, and that virtue comes by way of courage, And it comes by way of self-control and others that we're going to talk about. I want to tell you that they're not going to abandon you when you need them because they're a part of you. Sampson shows us what self-control is not. Peter is describing to us of what it is. It's this mean between these two extremes. And that when the storms of life come against us, and when pressures come at us, or situations come at us, we're not given over to the lack of self-control, because we practiced and fertilized and we nurtured this idea of what self-control is, so that when we need it, it's there. Well, that's kind of the first thing I want to talk about when we talk here about temperance today. We're going to talk about it for the next couple of weeks, but I hope I'm encouraging you to maybe go Google temperance, look at the virtue of temperance, begin to understand it, not just so you can intellectually understand it, but you can learn how to apply it to your life and see how very important it is for you as a Christian to have it. Because if you have this and the other virtues, if you practice those things, I guarantee you when the storms of life come at you, you are not going to be moved. And that's the birthright, and that's the privilege of us having the Spirit of God and being Christians. Well, I hope you'll think about it today. And have a great day, and I'll see you next week. God bless you.